My name is Gунnar Kvaran, and I'm a director of the Astrup Fearnley Museum in Oslo. And I'm going to do a lecture on the ways of collecting. The lecture is entitled The Horizontal International Art World. I have been working as a director for the Astrup Fearnley Museum for the last 20 years. And my work has been to build up a collection of international contemporary art and to organize exhibitions. And this is a private museum, and it is important to in fact define and describe the differences between the public institution and the private institution. In Oslo, so there is a national gallery that has been collecting, of course, Norwegian art. They have a long history, and it's quite a linear museum, trying to show a good survey of different movement, different artists within the Norwegian art history. And then this private museum, the Astrup Fearnley Museet, was opened in '93, and it is based on a private collection of Mr. Hans Rasmus Astrup. And Mr. Astrup, he comes from a collecting family. It's been quite a rich family from the beginning of 19th century, and they have always collected in international artists, and probably it had something to do with their main occupation, that they were in the shipping business. So through the years they were sailing around the world, they were having projects around the world, and they were paid in different currencies in different countries, and probably collecting was one of the investment and one of the banking system of its time. So it was very clear for the collector that he wanted to add an international dimension to the city of Oslo. He wanted to give the public view on the contemporary art in an international context. But in the beginning, he went through different kind of phases in terms of collecting. He was in the beginning he was collecting the Parisian school. He then turned to the European pop artists like Arroyo, like Adami, like Erro, these kind of artists, and then he turned to the German expressionism of the 80s, and it was Kiefer and Immendorf and these very known people. And then he began to collect the young British artists in the beginning of the 90s. And when he showed his first exhibition in '93 at the museum, he walked around. He told me he walked around the space and he looked at the paintings, and already on the first day of the new museum, he thought it looked old-fashioned. So he decided to do something about it, and of course he knew the mechanism of collecting. He knew the important role of the dealers and the gallerists in that kind of context. And so he went to London to meet one of his main dealers and some of the gallerists, and he met with a guy whose name is Victor Ivor Braca. Maybe you have heard about this. He's still an important dealer in London. He looks like Mick Jagger. If you sometimes see him in an art fair, you will recognize him immediately. And so Hans Rasmus Astrup said to Ivor Braca, I have this feeling that the collection is a little bit old-fashioned. I would be be more contemporary. And Victor Braga, he turned to Hans Rasmus Astrup and he said, well, I know what you're looking for. And he added, we should go and meet with Mr. Damien Hirst. This was in '93. And Damien Hirst had showed his first work at the Venice Biennale and then also in Jeu de Paume in Paris. The splitted cow, the mother and child divided. And Hans Rasmus was totally fascinated by this work, and he said, well, I would like to buy this. This is the new chapter of my private museum collection. And then they said, I'm sorry. You know, of course, these great museums like Pompidou, like Tate, we have to ask them first, because, I mean, this is a masterpiece of 20th century, and this has to go to an important collection. And then he turned to the collection, to these museums. And first he talked to the Tate, and the Tate said, no, this is not for me. For us, this is too complicated, and it's grotesque. We can't include this into our collection. And then they asked the Pompidou, and then Pompidou said in a very refined, sophisticated way, no, this is too complicated for us. So Mr. Astrup, he bought this work, and probably it was more expensive to transport it from London to Oslo than the price of the work itself. So then Mr. Astrup, he thought it would be interesting to, in fact, not collect in a linear way, but to collect individual artists, and maybe then to collect them in depth. And so this was in '93, and from '93 to 2000, he was the museum was trying to redefine their position, and then he began to look towards the United States, to North America. And in 2000, I was director of the Bergen Art Museum on the west coast of Norway, and Mr. Astrup came to see me, and he asked me if I would like to join him to become a director of the Astrup Fearnley Museum and to help him develop mostly the American collection. And that became an important part of my work these last 20 years. But at that time, we were already in a very interesting time concerning art history and the history of movements and the history, this kind of linear history that we are always referring to. So my task was to develop the American collection, and I had to turn back into and find the young generation in America. We had already, of course, seen what was in the historical books, and that was art until maybe 80s or 90s. But then from the 90s and from the year 2000, that was not really documented. So I proposed that we would do an exhibition based on research on the new generation of American artists. And I invited two curators to work with me on this exhibition. One of them was an old friend of mine who is now become a very famous curator, whose name is Hans-Ulrich Obrist. And the other one, who is also become a very famous curator, his name is Daniel Birnbaum. So for 2-3 years, we traveled all around North America to find the hidden, the secret, the new generation of American artists. And in 2005, we opened an exhibition entitled The Uncertain States of America. This is probably one of the best titles in the history of curating, absolutely. And I have to commit between you and me here tonight that we stole the title. We stole the title from another very famous exhibition about architecture that was the uncertain states of that time. But when we were working on this exhibition, we became quite aware of this kind of new situation in the art world. And we found out that there was no real common denominator in the world. And there was no any movement anymore that was dominating the situation. Before, we always had artistic movements that were related to some kind of geographical spaces. We had the pop art in New York, we had the abstract art in Paris, we had the Cubism in Paris, we had the minimalism in New York, and then all over we had arte povera in Italy and things like this. And all these kind of main strong dominating ideas, they became so much dominating that the rest of the world became a peripheral or a provincial situation. It was New York and pop, or New York and minimalism, and the rest of the world was some kind of echo of this. And we saw that there was no new kind of school or new kind of movement, and there was no common denominator. And in the beginning of this new century, Hans-Ole Gobrist was always repeating this question in lectures and also with among our friends, saying, so what is the name of this new century? We had, of course, the century of Impressionism, but what is the name of this new century? And then he came to the point that the name of the new century was, of course, the century without a name. So, in fact, we saw that this situation was about to change the world in a radical way. And it changed the world in a way that it was a world that has been always related to certain geographical spaces, and it was totally vertical. And at the time, we saw that the world was in a way of transformation. It was becoming more and more horizontal. Because in this new world, there was not only one art center or art power, it was in fact many. So we saw, and in the last 20 years, we have seen how the world has in fact grown and developed in this way. So now today we have a certain center in China. There is a power center in China. Chinese art is recognized as an important part of history. We have another power center in South America. We have another power center in North America. We have another power center in Europe, in Scandinavia. In my part of the world has also got its own small power center of artists, and so on and so on. In the Balkans, in the Eastern Europe, there are also exactly the same kind of situation. And it means that there is today it's not easy to argument that art is more interesting in this part of the world or in that part of the world, so to speak. And when I talk about the art world, it is very important to remember that I am talking about the art world in general. I'm not talking about the commercial art world, because the commercial art world has still its very, very strong and produced verticality. But the commercial art world is a very small part of the art world. And most of the artists in Europe, in France and Germany, they don't live from their art. They live from other kind of jobs. that is teaching in art schools, or it's working in museums, and so on and so on. In France, there is 3%. It has been already investigated, 3% of the artists. And in Scandinavia, most of the artists are state-driven. In Norway, they all have a salary from the state. So the art world that we are referring to is the great, big art world. Huh? So this is a totally a new kind of situation, which is, of course, interesting in terms of collecting. Because before, institutions and museums, they were collecting the Impressionists, or they were collecting the abstract artists, they were collecting certain periods and certain, but there were always some kind of narratives that would bring together this kind of collection. So today, and I will show you a little bit our research, what we have been doing in the last years in this kind of international context. Because we saw, as I told you in the beginning, as I said in the beginning, we were interested in American contemporary art. And of course, people say, why American? I mean, that was not very original. But in Scandinavia, it was quite unusual because the museums in Scandinavia, they have not been so much preoccupied by the American contemporary art. There were periods in the 60s where the Moderne Museet was collecting American art, late expressionists like Pollock and de Kooning and these people, and then of course the pop artist. But that was a very short period related to the director Pontus Hultén, and then Louisiana, which is also an incredibly interesting museum in Copenhagen, they have a fragmented selection of American art. So we thought it would be interesting because it was an open possibility to try to emphasize on this period of American artists from the 70s until now, and even a little bit for the future. So we found out that, of course, we were in connection to the last, maybe the last school in the contemporary art, the appropriation artist, with Richard Prince, with Cynthia Sherman, with all these famous artists. They were still dealing with certain kind of common ideas, and there was a certain kind of common denominator in their conceptual approach, and also in some way or another to their. But the next generation, they were, of course, some of them are related to this appropriation artist, but they are also inventing their own personal views and possibilities. So I'm going to go through 80 pictures here, 80 images of different artists, just to show you how our times and collecting has become a complicated but fascinating way of collecting. So, how do I do this? Good. So, there is no linearity in my narration. Huh? So, I will jump from different countries, but I will just comment. I will just comment these artists and their position and their and their preoccupation. First of all, there is an interesting. This is Armitage. You probably know this artist. He's a young black artist living in New York, in London. And it is very interesting to see how our times have, which is not dealing with artistic narratives, have also included other kinds of narratives, which are, of course, more sociological narratives. And in the last 10 years, the art world has become extremely interested, and they have a reason to it, about these black generations of artists. So museums and collectors in America and Europe have been more and more finding these black Americans in America and in London, and most of the artists, the black artists that we see in the galleries and the art fairs in general, they are not living in Africa. They are from the diaspora, but it has also giving now a certain kind of a possibility or a certain kind of view on the African art scene. So now, today, we see that museums in America, museums in Europe, they are now beginning to collect artists in Africa as artists related to their own community, like the black community in New York, the black community in Chicago, which is a very, the Theater Gates, which is a very strong community, and also in London. What characterizes all these artists is that they have their education in the Americans or the British universities, and they have totally assimilated the art of the Western society. It is also very interesting to remember one thing which I forgot in my introduction, is that the art world only 20, 30 years ago was so much smaller than the art world today. Because even though we abandoned this kind of the common denominator in terms of movement and schools of artists, there was another changes in the world that was really very powerful, and which is a little bit frightening at the same time. And it was that in some 20, 30 years ago, or during the last 20, 30 years, slowly by slowly, the Western notion of art has become a universal notion. So, for example, when we talk about Chinese contemporary art, we talk about artists who are using Western notion of art, and in China, these are artists that came to the art scene in the end of the 80s. Artists like Chai Gougan, like Wang Yongping, and maybe Ai Weiwei. These artists were all introducing Western notion of art. So in China, in this enormous country, we have only about 3 generations of contemporary artists who are all dealing with these kind of, who are all basing their work on the Western notion of art. At the same time, there is a parallel history being developed in China with their calligraphies, with their traditional works, more or less related to craft and with a slower development. The same thing is, for example, in Japan, and of course we can also find this in Africa, which is of course much more fragmented in this way. So today we have all the continents, included the Australia, where people are working with the same kind of premises, but the conclusions are totally, the results are quite often very, very different. It is clear that when these artists who are working from the Western notion of art can choose their own materials, can choose their own ideas, can choose their own procedures, there are many things that will influence their way of expressing themselves, and there are things like just their language, their way of thinking, their climate, the different kinds of cultural context where they are living that will have an influence on what they are producing as an artistic expression. So in these images that we are going to see, we are turning from one to another. So here is a Thai artist. Korakrit is a young artist from Thailand who is living between Bangkok and New York, and he's educated in New York, but his themes and his preoccupations is very much related to his own history and to the story of his country related to the international politics. And here is a very interesting sculpture that he made a few years ago, last year, and it's a sculpture of the United Nations building in New York with these kind of two elements that look like destructive elements, but also as two kinds of Thai goddesses that come and question, but also possibly save the United Nations that is in a crisis. And Mr. Korakrit has been very preoccupied by the weakness of these kind of international institutions. And so this is an art form that takes elements from different things that we have seen in the international art world, but all the narratives are very personal, and the way how he puts this together is maybe difficult to put into a certain kind of artistic context. Then we have still a very strong a big number of artists who are dealing with some kind of neo-modernistic ideas. But it's not a movement in the sense of common vocabulary or common, it's more about trying to appropriate certain kind of characteristics from philosophical characteristics from the old times, but trying to get it through new materials and new technologies. So each and every one of these artists has his own way of printing or scanning or painting, which is based on their own kind of research. Trishabaga is also one of these. I think she comes from. She is based in New York, but she is. I don't remember exactly. I think she comes from Tahiti or something like that. And these are very complicated narrative structures, installations that deal with the modern life, including computer and digital world, but also the waste and the ecological questions. And it's layers and layers, and you are invited into this kind of very multi-semantic environment. And it can be different kind of scale. It can be down to 20 square meters, but it can also be blown up to a size of 200 square meters. And then we have this new kind of sculpture. And Mr. Frank Benson is somewhere, he's a student of Charlie Ray, and in the beginning, he was doing these kind of sculptures. This is a man pretending to be a sculpture. It's a sculpture. So it's a play on this word. But very early, he thought it was interesting to introduce the new technical possibilities to influence his aesthetical views. So in doing these kind of sculpture, he did not do a modeling. He took photographs of the model, and in his sculpture he uses models that have an important saying in the position and in the attitude of the sculpture. So this is a very famous New York choreographer and a dancer that imposed the pose in the sculpture, and then he photographed her, and then he printed it out in 3D, and then he cast the 3D elements and then he made it into bronze. So in between his modeling or the photography or the model and what we see is in fact the influence of the digital printing. And that's why it has this kind of very distant look, which is an aesthetics, which seems to be very classic, but it is in fact somewhere in between reality and the classical sculpture. And here we have another one of his sculptures, who is Juliana Huxtable, who is a very famous DJ and a pop star, and she's a transgender, as you can see. And so she was a model, but she was also a collaborator in this work in terms of the color, in terms of these are her colors as a visual artist. She's a photographer and a visual artist, and she is here in one of her favorite position. This is a work from, as you can see, from 2016. Paul Chan is a very good example of this kind of new, very original artists who have been dealing with videos. He introduced a totally new way of narrating with video, and it was all about shadows. It is always that his work come from the outside. So he will film or he will construct like it was a shadow of something that was outside of his own space. So as you can see here, it is a part of his series of works called The Light. It's 6 works that show these works that are falling, or these elements or these objects that are falling, or they are going up to heaven. And this is in fact related to a very political situation which was connected to Mr. Bush at the time, that there was a rumor or there was a saying that he was connected to some kind of religious sect in America, and this sect believed in the end of the world. And so Paul Chan, he imagined procedures and a narrative where God would save all the things and people that he preferred in the contemporary society. But then we saw in the work of Paul Chan that God was only interested in materialism. It was only interested in computers and the smartphones and things that we also are fascinated about. So he did also this incredible, interesting digital video, and this is one of the first where you are drawing with the computer techniques. This is a work that you saw maybe in the Venice Biennale in 2009 and 2010, and it's a history of Sade, Marquis de Sade, and it's a certain kind of resume of one of his novels. And then here, Yan Cheng is a young Chinese artist, which is American. He's originally from Hong Kong, but he moved very young to America. And he's a very good example of this kind of new artist. And the new artist is, in fact, educated in a different way. Now we have noticed that there are many artists who don't go to art school immediately. They go to some other kind of profession. They can study to be engineers, they can study to be lawyers, or they can study to be doctors or chemistry or whatever. And then they become artists. And Yan Cheng was studying artificial intelligence. And he was a brilliant student from Harvard, and he could have gone into Toyota or Sony or everybody, but he became an artist. And what characterizes this work here is a little bit the same kind of preoccupation as with Mr. Paul Chan. They are trying to reinvent new kind of narrative structures, how we tell stories in videos and with figurative elements. So he was one of the first, and this is not a long time ago, it's only in 2013, it was in 2012 that he introduced the first image with his algorithm. That is that he would paint and draw and place these different elements into his computer, and then it would be the computer with the algorithm that would create its own narratives. So the computer would, of course, create infinitive narratives. It will last forever because it's forever, and it is possible. And each time each scene is invented by the computer. So he is there only to create certain kind of conditions to give the character certain kind of characteristics and to give the scene certain kinds of elements, if it vegetables like trees or birds or things like this, but the whole narratives itself take place within the computer. Huh? So this was quite a change when it came. And then we have this very interesting Nikhil Chopra that really invented or questions the notion of happening. And he has gone into his kind of colonial past in India. So he's been, in fact, redoing this kind of scenery that he has found in old albums and old photography and old paintings, showing him how the colonial times, how the British were being exposed and how they were living their lives in the India at the time. In China, this is Zhu Yong, who is a part of this third generation of artists, and it's difficult to place him also in this kind of historical context, but he has been working with this kind of equipment that you know. We have these computers, we have this hi-fi, we have this old washing machine, we have all these things. But all these elements here, they have certain kind of, for example, a light. So you see that when you come into the room, this is what you see, and it is like a starry sky. It is like a dream. It's like a view to the universe. Huh? And then, by being there a few minutes, there operates a certain kind of physical transformation that we all know about, which gives you this, which is the trash, which is the old leftovers of these kind of technical equipment that are now beginning to drown the planet. And then he has also this kind of another view on the community, and in this work he took these soaps from public toilets in Shanghai or Guangzhou, I think it was in Guangzhou, and he stole these soaps and exhibited as testimonies of different kinds of individual touch. Here is the youngest generation of the Chinese painters. She is, Zhu Xi is probably some 25 years old. She is, first of all, a painter, and she is passionate about the city of Beijing. So she is painting the city, and the city of Beijing and the city of Shanghai also is in a continual transformation, especially cities like Guangzhou and Shanghai. You can come 1 year, and the year after, certain neighborhoods are totally gone and transformed. So she is, in fact, taking her some kind of cartography of things into her context. So these are a little bit, there are elements that you recognize from, I would say, some kind of Eastern Europe, Sovietic aesthetics, but it has to do with some kind of future vision, but in China it's still in a certain kind of movement. So. Simon Denny, you know, in 2014 he did a big series which was a research of a certain international technological company, and he went into studying the economy of the company, studying the technology of the company, the stock market and all of this. And this is a very typical of what is happening now with these different artists. They are always, very often, of course, preoccupied by inventing new rules and regulation in the aesthetical terms, but they are also very much about doing these kind of personal archives and personal investigation. Like this incredible Trisha Donnelly, American artist, that is always dealing with the invisible. So it's always about that we don't see, it's always about the ephemeral, it's always about we don't really recognize, it's always somewhere behind something that we have seen before. And here it is a very big granite stone that where she has sketched, draw into the stone a certain kind of reflection, a little bit like Paul Chan, that came from the outside as a shadow of a fragmented outside world that does not have any kind of narrative saying or a meaning, but it's attesting a certain kind of feeling that she is translating from the light to the granite. And then we have this kind of Norwegian artist, Gardred Einarsson, and he has been very interested in the prism system in America. So it's all about creating very big, important narratives about policemen, about a certain kind of codes in the criminal world, code in the prisons, some kinds of tattoo codes that are in the criminal milieu, and telling us always of this kind of very semiotic based stories. This is a very, I don't remember what is really but it has a very concrete telling of the policemen with their arms. We have to go fast. It's Lizzie Fish and Ryan Trackerton, and Ryan Trackerton is of course known for his video, this kind of MTV based videos. He was the one who really introduced the youth culture into the American youth culture into the videos. His videos, they you always experience them as some kind of trash, or some kind of nonsense, some kind of absurd situation, but in fact they are extremely well constructed. They are all written down in terms of manuscripts, and they have a very solid kind of narratives about this kind of alienated generation of young people that are living mostly inside of their video games and MTV music world, etc. And all his videos are always seen together with this kind of different kind of furniture that complement the aesthetics in a very, very, very efficient way. Huh? This is also from it is in fact a video in two parts on And then in his videos, he uses these props that become then individual sculptures, and this is a very interesting sculpture that is in fact some kind of a synthesis of a video presentation where he does a certain kind of resume of a certain kind of narratives from a video, but in the sculptural sense. So this is a scene from a coffee, and it is, of course, we could maybe compare it to this kind of cubist view of pressing time into a new kind of object. But in fact, there are very many layers and different kinds of views and angles to the sculptures. Here we have Shilpa Gupta from India, and she took all these very dangerous tools and weapons that were taken from people that were going on board on the plane, and so she could negotiate these objects from the security police in Delhi, and she made this kind of very feministic work where she showed these kind of feminist pockets for all these dangerous women, transforming them and giving them a different kind of sensibility. It's a very efficient and very strong work in terms of gender and gender aesthetics. Rachel Harrison is one of these young Americans that are inventing new kinds of narratives with paintings and found objects and figurative or abstract. But it is still related in one way or another to some earlier American artists. Here we have Romuald Hassoumé, comes from Benin in Africa, and he is one of those artists who is very well educated, but he has always lived in Benin. He is a local artist, and he works out of course, he works out of the African mask tradition, but at the same time, he is aware of Picasso, he's aware of the Surrealist, he's aware of how modern art has also taken advantage of this, of the African culture and masks, and he revisits it in that sense. Here's another Norwegian artist who is exploring the archives of the police, and the police has different kind of archives. One of the archives of the police in America is based on photographs from rooms that have where terrorists have been living, and they try to read the patterns out of the rooms, and for example out of the beds where these people were sleeping, and to see if they can find some kind of signs and characteristic in their environment that could echo their kind of personality. And the artist has used these kind of ideas to create a certain kind of portrait of himself. Here we have Juliana Huxtables. We remember her from the sculpture of Frank Benson, and it's a photography, colored photography, that is of course to do with gender and the notion of who and what we are, the third sex in a way. And here we have Alex Israel that brings back this kind of, he is in LA. The LA has a long history of sun and Hollywood and the bright urbanism, and he has created a certain kind of self-portrait in the light of the vision of LA. This is too also one of his glass pieces. Here we have, of course, Sergei Jensen, a German artist that you know, and is a conceptual artist. And this is very strong today. It is this kind of semiotic abstractions that we are semiotic paintings of Peter Haley in the 80s, but now it's more generated in semiotic narratives, and this is all these kind of paper, these kind of bags that were used to transport money. So they look like bills, but they are not bills. They are in fact the different bags that were used to transport the bags. Here is Rashid Johnson, who is also one of these new generation of Black American artists, who has been mostly famous for these kind of narrative works with the mirrors and with different kinds of elements, always telling the story about the black community in America. And here we have Josh Klein, work from 2060s, and there is also this very strong political movement in America, but it's also very fragmented. And you remember when they had the crash in 2008, I think, and there was another crash in 2015 where thousands of financial people lost their jobs, and there was a lot of suicide, there was a lot of very terrible situation in New York also, and there was people lost their jobs, lost their homes and everything. And this is one of the financial bureaucrats that had lost everything, and he is now found in this bag, and this is really the belongings to these new kinds of individuals, these new kind of citizens that have this kind of ephemeral lives, which is totally based on this kind of financial ephemeral world. This is the poverty dilatation. So these are all objects that are being cast. So what characterizes maybe the American scene more than anyone else in the world is this huge, very important production. It is always a very, you can see that maybe where we see the differences today between the Americans art and the other ones, it's mostly the production which is quite important. And then we have this reminiscence of the neo-modernism that we talked about. This is a young Norwegian artist that are working with self-portraits, but also referring to art history. We have, of course, the reference to Bruce Nauman. We have reference to this kind of arabesque painting history, and then we, of course, the reference to his always. This young lady, Margaret Lee, a Korean artist living in New York, she's also a very famous and efficient gallerist, and she has been doing these kind of interiors, which are always metaphorical and metamorphosis from the vegetal world to the real world. This is an eggplant becoming a telephone, and all of their work are in certain kind of Kafkaesque style, where you have these kind of spaces within other spaces. This is some of the work. And here we have this wonderful work by Liu Wei of the Chinese artist, and this is from 2007, and it is really a good example of these kind of third generation. He made in the beginning a performance that was one power building that he made of this kind of beef skin, and then he wanted the dog to eat the building, to attack the building. And it was, of course, a very powerful metaphor against the establishment, against the political system, and then he changed his mind, and we went to visit him in 2006, and he was telling us about this performance, and then he decided to create a whole city. So he created a whole city with all the power buildings in the world. So there were power buildings from China, from America, from London, from Paris, that he then brought together as the power system of the world. This is the same artist with this kind of a new kind of library. Nate Lohman is also one of this new generation. He's maybe the one who is the most established of this young artist. And in the beginning, he was doing these kind of installations that they were always about some kind of event. And he's been very preoccupied by the violence in the American media and in the American society. So this one here was all about famous people who have all gone through some kind of violent turbulence. So there were very famous people, and they are in each of they are explained these kind of violent periods they went through. Here is a typical American poster that people put on their cars. These are small tickets like this, and he painted a big series of these bullet holes, and then he created America from the leftovers of his studio. This is this last painting, and it is a very famous crime story from LA that turned out very badly, and it is once more a very political and very socially engaged, but at the same time he is very preoccupied by trying to invent a new kind of écriture, new kind of style, which how the forms are being made and copied inside of his painting. Once again, back to China, and here we have this very interesting work by Mei Tin, whose name is also Zhu Zhan. He is a Chinese artist of the third generation, and in the last years he's been very interested in creating images as a certain kind of amalgam or a synthesis of the internet. So here we have this kind of African costume, if it is maybe also a North Alaska costume. There is a computer disk there, and there is also this kind of sadomaso sexual position, but it's also a reference to the Japanese photographer Araki, and so on and so on. But the image is a certain kind of synthesis of what he had found in the internet. And here is an artist from Ghana who is working with always with this kind of leftover different kind of materials that have this kind of semantic undertone. These are bags that were used for certain kind of food, and here we drop back to LA. Here we go to London to see Helen Martin, who is one of the youngest and most complicated figures of the new London scene, a very literary artist who makes videos and sculptures and paintings. These are totally incomprehensible sculptures by Helen Martin and paintings. And here from Brazil we have Diego de Mello, a very political artist who is painting the corruption in Brazil, a historical president that went to prison, and the artist and his wives are killing pigs in the foreground of his paintings as a metaphor for the cleaning up of the political situation in Brazil. And life is always a little bit fun in Congo, and here is a painting by Mika, a very young artist in Congo. There's a very strong tradition of figurative, decorative paintings in Congo, and these are very interesting because he takes these kind of napkins, or no, what do you call it? On the tables you put what is the name? On the tables you have cloth on the tablecloth, and in this tablecloth are with this kind of print of these flowers, and then he paints the figure into the paintings, and he paints over certain elements of the flowers. It's a really amazing paintings. This one here also, and these are of course self-portrait of the good time in Congo. And we jump a little bit to Lithuania, I think, or to Kaja Notviskova, and sorry, Estonia, sorry, and she has introduced this kind of new, this kind of like theater screens that have one side with the image, and then there's the back side, which is the hidden side. And these can be animals, they can be clouds, they can be different kinds of narratives. And here we go back to Brazil. This is a young artist that was a very famous street artist, and there are not many artists that can manage to come from the street to the studio. We have seen that, but he is absolutely one of those who have really been able to take the logics of the streets into his own paintings, and he has tried to continue to use the narrative structure of the street, where different kinds of people are invited to jump into the creativity process and add their elements to the works in the street. He creates the same kind of situation in his studio. So he paints certain kinds of elements. He gives the painting a certain kind of political meaning, and in terms of violence, in terms of wars, in terms of relationship between the soft and the hard, and things like this. But then he invites people, colleagues, to comment on his own paintings. Here is the Norwegian photographer Thorbjørn Rødland, who has become quite an important photographer. These images are from 2001. He was fascinated by the Norwegian hard rock, Black Death rock groups in Norway. There's quite a lot of them in Scandinavia, but his works have developed in a very strange and very sensual and pervert situation of these young women, of these difficult kind of situation, which are half sexual, half athletic, half something else. But there is always a very pervert undertone in these works. And then this is also Mr. Rødland, as you can see. And here we have Amadou San Ogo, who is one of these painters. I don't remember when I think he's from Mali or Senegal maybe. And these are all very narrative works with very precise semantic references. And we can see that it takes a lot of elements from the local craft. So it's and Getty Siboni, American artist. I go fast now because things are getting very late, and I wanted to come to the end, which is getting closer and closer. And here we have another of these kind of semiotic painters, a Norwegian painter who has quite an important position now, and it's all about his house. So he paints this kind of abstract paintings. They're all paintings, but it's all about his childhood, about his. So these are the curtains of his home, and these are very common curtains in Norway. Every house has this kind of outside curtains. So he painted that, and this was the floor, this kind of industrial floor that was in his house also. And in his neighborhood, you have these kind of boats so these are all a series, many series, about 10 series of very abstract paintings, but they have all this kind of semantic narratives about his own bringing. Here we have Jonas Wood from LA, of course. Somewhere it reminds us of Hockney, but it is in fact this kind of the good life of LA, and then it is the political work of Suzanne, which shows an invasion of Chinese army into Burma, and it's a total fiction, of course, but it shows how these Chinese artists are extremely good with this kind of metaphorical political narratives. These are all small models that are being placed in the nature. They are filmed, they are photographed, and they are then showed in this kind of context with the car, which is an exploration car, but we can see at the same time it is a very important military action. He has also been on the internet, as I told you before, and of course he found these wonderful women there, and he also made this incredible collage of textile sculpture. This was the marathon.